Hello everyone and welcome to Fiction Friday. Today we have episode 16 of The Squire. I hope you enjoy it.
Cole knocked on the door to the room they'd set aside for bathing. Rain should be almost finished with her turn. He carried a nice pair of boots, trousers, and a gray blouse, all nicked from the Baron's bedroom. He doubted the nobleman and his wife would return, and even if they did, they had so many clothes the loss of one outfit might not even be noticed. Besides, if Rain wore that shredded dress for many more days, she'd end up naked, and her feet needed more protection than those slippers could offer. Even if the size wasn't exactly right, it would be better than what she had now. "What is it?" Rain's muffled voice filtered through the door. "I found you a change of clothes. I'll leave them outside the door." "Hold on." A second later, the door opened partway, and Rain's hand and a bare arm were thrust out. Cole put the boots in her hand and draped the clothes over her arm. "Thanks." The arm disappeared, and the door closed. Cole leaned against the wall to wait. He'd collected everything else he thought they'd need for the trip. Now all he needed was Rain. 10 minutes later, and the door opened, and the princess stood, dressed in fresh clothes, hair still dripping, ready to go. "Do they fit okay?" Rain nodded. "They aren't bad. Where'd you get them?" "The Baron's wife donated them." "Are you ready to go?" She nodded again and followed him down to the entry hall where he'd left a pair of stuffed packs and his satchel. As they walked down the stairs, she said, "When you say donated, you mean you stole them, right?" "Right. Don't worry, her wardrobe survived the loss." They reached the entry hall and found Ged and Mara waiting for them. Cole grimaced. He'd hoped to make a clean getaway. "Are you sure I can't persuade you to stay?" Ged asked. "It's dangerous out there." "Can't argue with you there," Cole said. "But we can't stay." Ged gestured for him to come a few steps away from the hugging women. "You're no more a caravan guard than I am a merchant prince. Who are you two, really?" Cole's eyes narrowed. "I'm nobody, and Rain's my sister. If anybody asks, that's what you tell them. Better yet, after we leave, pretend you never met us. We'll all be better off." Ged held out his hand and Cole shook it. "Thanks for everything. We never would have made it without you. Whoever you two are and wherever you're going, I wish you the best of luck." "Likewise. One last piece of advice. If you can, try to sneak back to the fort and collect the weapons we left behind. A time will come when we have to reclaim this land, and we'll need all the weapons we can lay our hands on." Cole and Rain shouldered their packs and headed out the gate. When they'd left the castle behind, Rain asked, "Do you think they'll be okay?" "As long as there are beastmen running loose in the kingdom, none of us are safe. Still, they have some fighting experience now, and those stone walls will help. What will help the most is us not being there to draw the Dark Caster's attention." Weary and relieved, Cole spotted the chimneys of Pike's Cove jutting above the tree line a few hours before sunset. They'd made the hike in 3.5 days. Better than he'd hoped. He suspected Rain's improved fitness had more to do with it than anything. She'd kept up with his pace, not uttering a word of complaint. That surprised him, and he thanked the light for the change. They crossed out of the evergreens and onto a packed dirt road leading into the town. "Is that it?" Rain asked. "If the map was right, it should be. I can smell the water from here, so we're close to the lake. Let's go take a look." They continued into the village and found the buildings unharmed and no sign of beastman activity. It looked like the enemy hadn't come this way, or they decided the little village didn't constitute a threat. Cole shook his head. They couldn't have come this way. The monsters would have burned the town on principle if they'd found it. "Halt!" 4 men in mail and carrying broadswords appeared from around a small cedar-sided house at the edge of the village. Cole held his hands to the side away from his sword. These 4 looked like real soldiers, and the last thing he wanted was to make them nervous. He moved a little ahead of Rain. "We're not looking for trouble. We've been on the run from beastmen for going on 3 weeks now." The soldiers lowered their weapons a fraction. One of the men wearing a sergeant's insignia stepped closer. "You don't have fangs or claws, so that's a point in your favor. Who might you be, then?" Cole reached down the front of his tunic and pulled out his bronze medallion. "Squire Cole. I'm the last survivor of the Order. Everyone else died defending the castle." The soldiers all sheathed their weapons at once. "Squire,
Thank the light. Dealing with a beastman invasion's a little outside my area of expertise. I'm Sergeant Smith. How'd you escape?
Cole took a breath. Time for a leap of faith. I had a mission. He motioned Rain to stand beside him. This is Princess Rain. My last orders were to get her out of the kingdom and to safety. The soldiers all took a knee.
Princess, we're so glad to see you safe.
Rain placed a hand on Smith's shoulder. Thank you. Please rise. Cole smiled. That was the most regal he'd ever seen her. We headed for Rel first, but it's overrun. Beastmen are everywhere, south and west of here.
Don't we know it, sir? We've killed 3 scouting parties in the past week. If they come against us in any numbers, this little town won't last an hour.
Cole took in the defenses, or more accurately, the complete lack of defenses, with a glance. I see your problem. Is there somewhere we can talk?
Sure, we've converted the only inn into a command post. The locals spend most of their time out fishing, but a few stay in town to help out.
The sergeant turned to his men.
You 3 get back on patrol. I'll take our guests to the inn.
They walked deeper into the village, following the sergeant to the inn. Pike's Cove was a charming place, 1- and 2-story buildings with cedar siding and tile roofs. The occasional trickle of smoke came from the chimneys. If not for the threat of imminent destruction, this would have made a nice place to spend a few days. The inn had a red tile roof and 2 stories. It looked like the biggest building in the village. The sergeant reached for the door, but Cole stopped him. Let's keep it quiet about the princess. The fewer people that know she's here, the safer she'll be.
Right, sir. Mum's the word.
Inside the common room sported the usual collection of tables and chairs, several of which the soldiers had pushed together and covered with maps. Along the back wall rested a bar, behind which stood a 1-armed man with a long beard. He glanced over at them when they entered, and, apparently not seeing anything worth his time, went back to polishing the bar. Cole made a beeline for the map table, eager for more information about the enemy forces. He was doomed to disappointment. Beyond marking Rel as fallen and the location of 2 skirmishes with Beastman scouts, the map held no useful information. It took all of 2 minutes for Cole to update the map with what they knew, which amounted to precious little when you looked at it. Cole leaned back in his chair and sighed. The sergeant looked at him.
What now, sir?
Supper, if you have anything to spare. When the fishermen bring in their catch, we need to find someone to take us to Celestia. I suppose you know who's trustworthy?
Yes, sir. Truth is, they're all good lads mostly. 1 or 2 like a drink more than they should, and another couple enjoy a fight. But none that aren't loyal to the crown.
Cole smiled. Sailors that like to drink and fight. Perish the thought. The sergeant laughed, having the same sense of humor as all the men-at-arms he'd dealt with over the years.
The cook has fish stew going. I'll fetch you a couple bowls.
Cole moved to an empty table a safe distance from the maps, and Rain joined him. He seems nice. Most of the men-at-arms I've met over the years are loyal and tough as boot leather, with a rough sense of humor. I'm not sure if the recruiters look for men like that or if they grow into the personality. Either way, 10 men like him are worth 100 farmers in a fight. You seem pleased to find them here. Princess, you have no idea. If I had to explain the basics to another amateur, I was going to explode. The sergeant emerged from the kitchen with 2 steaming bowls. The smell of cream mingled with fish and herbs set Cole's mouth watering. Won't you join us? Rain asked. He shook his head.
I'll eat later with my men, but thank you for the invitation, Highness.
The sergeant took his leave, and when he'd gone, Rain said, he seemed uncomfortable. Nobles have that effect on commoners. Don't take it personally. Cole tucked into his stew. When he came up for air, Rain said, You seem comfortable enough with me. He wiped the broth from his lips and smiled. I've had weeks of practice. We didn't do so well at the start of this little adventure. You hated me. Cole started to argue, but she held a hand up. It's the truth, and I don't blame you. When I look back at who I was before the attack, I find I hate myself a little. Cole reached across the table and took her hand. It's who you are now that counts, and I like that person a great deal. Rain stood in front of the fishing vessel Cole had chosen to carry them to Celestia. They'd been traveling for the better part of 3 days. The wind blew her hair back from her face and the stink from the hold away from her nose. She smiled at how much she'd come to rely on the Squire. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have trusted him to choose his own socks, much less the best way to get to Celestia. He'd shown himself to be competent, far more competent than Rain herself. The few times she'd traveled out of the capital, she'd had dozens of soldiers and servants to tend to her every need, and they stayed at the finest inns or the mansions of nobles. This journey had been a revelation to her, and not a good one. "Princess," she turned to see Cole approaching from the back of the boat where he'd been speaking with the captain. "Everything all right?" She nodded and looked out over the calm, blue water. In the opposite direction, she could still see the shore. "It doesn't seem so dangerous out here." "It isn't. Sailors discovered the safe zone extends 200 miles from shore. Any further out than that, though, and you run into trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Cole shrugged. It seemed there were a few things he didn't know about the wilds. "No one knows. No ship that sailed that far out has ever come back. The rumor is that a monster-filled island sits in the center of the lake, and if anyone gets too close, the monsters attack." A shiver ran up her spine. More monsters. Fantastic. "Ever think you'd like to sail out there and see what sort of monsters you might find?" He grinned. "Nope. There are plenty of monsters on dry land to deal with. Never saw much point in sailing out to find more." "Do you still plan to leave as soon as we reach Celestia?" By the light, she sounded needy. The cocky grin softened. "I'm not planning to throw you off at the dock and sail away. At some point I have to come back, but it won't be until you're settled. Besides, I'm hoping whoever's in charge over there can offer me some help. After all, they have an army, and I'm just one person." Rain smiled when he repeated her own words back to her. He'd been listening. She couldn't say why, but that made her feel good. Her tension went away a little when he promised not to leave her at the docks. Maybe Celestia wouldn't be so bad. The dark's might coursed through Zarin, and he sent it spiraling into the stone watchtower from which Rel's archers harassed his beastmen. The 3-story tower crashed to the ground, killing the archers on impact. The Darkcaster never would have believed the battle would drag on for weeks. He would have sighed if he still had lungs that functioned. The running battle through the night city reminded him of the old days when he fought beside his master to crush their enemies. Over 900 years had passed since his master fell in the final battle, yet it could have been yesterday in his memories. An arrow skipped off his skull. Zarin turned in time to see another nuisance of an archer duck behind a half-ruined building. A blast of dark power annihilated the building and the man behind it. He looked around for another target, but saw only his beastmen. The center of the city had withstood them longer than he expected, no doubt due to the efforts of the light's servants from the temple. Pale imitations of the foes he'd once faced, the light casters nonetheless knew enough tricks to slow his army down. Despite the resistance, he'd sent out his scouts weeks ago to try to locate the princess and her guardian without noticeable success. Well, now that he'd dealt with this final batch of fighters, he'd look to finding her again. It wouldn't be difficult. Her celestial blood would call to him like a beacon. If they still traveled alone, he'd have no better hope of killing them than he had last time. Zarin shook his head and walked away from the battlefield. Even if he couldn't kill her, at least he could find out where she was so he could send more beastmen to finish the job. He focused on the dark and tore a black circle in the air. He stepped through and emerged in the courtyard of Castle Finegold. A couple minutes later, he reached his casting chamber and settled on the floor within his protective circle. He willed his spirit free of his host and drifted above the corpse. It became clear to him that he'd need to prepare a new host soon. This one would crumble to dust if he left it again. No matter, it had served its purpose. He focused on the princess and in moments felt a tug toward the lake. He allowed the feeling to guide him onward, closer and closer to his target. Soon he hovered over a fishing boat off the coast of the fallen kingdom of Kenton. She'd made it this far already? If Zarin had delayed even another day, she would have been off the coast of Celestia and almost beyond his reach. He thanked the dark for his good fortune and dove toward the boat. Zarin passed like mist through the deck and entered the crew quarters. little more than a small room with hammocks hanging from the wall. He found the princess and the boy sleeping in 2 of the hammocks. 2 more hung empty. That meant at least 2 unprotected humans were somewhere on the boat. Perfect. Zarin left the crew quarters and went back up on deck. He found 1 man at the tiller and a second in the rigging. It would be too difficult to control the body in the rigging, so he jammed a spectral hand into the man's chest and stopped his heart. The sailor gasped and fell into the water. The second man rushed to the rail and looked for his shipmate. Zarin slipped into his body and in seconds had complete control. A quick search revealed an oil lantern the boat used to send signals. Zarin smashed it on the deck, drew the man's long, curved knife, and struck the bent steel lantern until he got a spark. The oil burned across the deck, scorching his feet. Zarin's dead host didn't register pain, so he lurched toward the crew quarters, knife in hand. He'd end this chase right now.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Fiction Friday. If you liked what you heard, you can find more of my fiction on my website, jamesewisher.com. Please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with anyone else you think might enjoy the show. Until next week, goodbye.